I don't know if you've noticed, but this month is Mental Health Awareness Month. That means that there's many people that are concerned with the mental health of our teens. But does being concerned and raising awareness of teen mental health really help them? We're going to talk about that next in the Celebrate Kids podcast in our daily segment, Facing the Dark. But before we do, I want to let you know that this episode is brought to you by Summit Ministries. Summit Ministries does a fantastic job of speaking into the hearts and minds of young people. Kids that are in high school and college age can go on a 2-week deep dive into Christian worldview. And a lot of it actually builds in an identity and an understanding and confidence that God really is who he says he is, the creator and the sustainer of all things, and also the one who provides salvation for us as people who are in need of a savior. Their 2-week camps in Colorado Springs and Lookout Mountain, Georgia are dynamic. And Dr. Kathy is a speaker there. For more information on Summit Ministries, go to summitministries.org/celebrate kids. Now let's turn to Dr. Kathy Cook.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
So, Dr. Kathy, this month is Mental Health Awareness Month. But in an opinion piece at the New York Times, Lucy Fulkes, an academic psychologist at Oxford University, argues that the problem may not be a lack of awareness, but actually too much awareness to mental health. Amid an enormous societal push to destigmatize mental illness and encourage more conversation about emotions, young people have been flooded with mental health information on social media and really almost everywhere else. Schools, churches, everyone's working to give them mental health information. But what many are coming out saying is that it is often unreliable and sometimes counterproductive. Fulkes says, quote, "I'm deeply concerned that this awareness craze is ironically making teen mental health worse," end quote. Dr. Kathy, is Dr. Fulkes right to be aware of the mental health awareness craze? Is it causing more harm than good?
I've wondered the same thing. So I love that she's bravely bringing this out in a major publication. I think kids have said, young people, teenagers have said it's hard to be normal. And sometimes they say that in the context of gender and sexuality. But I also wonder if that's just a general phrase that they're aware that everybody around them is getting attention for having some mental health issue. And they're wondering, is it okay to be normal? And what if I don't have anything wrong with me? Like, should I have something wrong with me? And then they look for something to be wrong. They invent something like my family isn't perfect either. And we just invite them to go to a place where they don't need to go. It is okay to be normal. And it's totally okay to not have a mental health issue. So yeah, I think this is fascinating.
Yeah, I wonder, Dr. Kathy, we read a book between the two of us. I kind of want to say our team, but our team is you and me, and we give each other a lot of high fives and, go team go kind of thing. But our team really read this book, Bad Therapy by Abigail Shrier. And we've, wrestled it out and talked through it in a number of different contexts. One of the things that she talks about is this movement towards what's called social emotional learning. It's in schools and things of that nature. And in many ways, social emotional learning works to kind of have everyone in a classroom talk about the challenges that they might be facing and open up each other's eyes to really the perspective that each person has in a situation. So I might be battling with something today, and so might another friend. And there's this idea that we can kind of build some camaraderie, or at least, call us to be more aware of the emotional health or wellness of a classroom. Is that rhythm of calling each other to talk about our maybe deficiencies or our challenges or what might be bothering us, to give other people perspective, a good practice in some of this? I think that happens a lot with mental health, where we kind of blow this up and say, well, let's talk about now your mental health. Here's my mental health. And we kind of go around the circle and just share how we're doing. Is that a healthy practice for us to do with kids in this context?
It's a great question. It reminds me of the fireside chats at church camp, where you're kind of able to be honest with the s'more. I love s'mores, so I just had to throw that in there. I think it's super healthy for children to be aware of the emotions. I think it's extremely important that parents and people who are on their side help them understand the difference between, sad and mad. It does concern me when it's done in the public schools, where I do think there's an agenda. And when we don't know perhaps where the teacher in charge is going to lead the students, I think that becomes really dangerous. So it's awkward. Do children need to understand emotions matter? Absolutely. Feelings can be prioritized because they do change behavior, but they should not lead us. And unfortunately, we live in a culture that is often feeling led, and that's where some of this movement comes from. So it's hard, right? Are feelings legit? Absolutely. Are they worth talking about and naming and defining and understanding where they come from? What should I do with it? Absolutely. Does it need to be said in front of 25 members of the peer group? I don't think so. Because now all the friends know that that kid is lonely or that kid is stressed or that kid gets hit. Now that's used against them in a bully situation and isn't appropriate in that setting.
Yeah, I've always wondered that a little bit. Is your identity just that thing that's built because of frequency? And so, do we just talk about this idea of my emotions and how I'm feeling today? And that ends up becoming, because I'm thinking about it in greater frequency, just that idea of who I am, whoever I present myself to be in those conversations, or however I may be affirmed in those different conversations, where I might appreciate having a little bit more attention. And so let me share more things that I've been, thinking about or challenged by or wrestling with. I wonder about some of this too. When we talk about even that idea of how frequency drives and encourages identity, is that maybe a guide for us with identity formation, that we should pull back from talking so much about mental health and maybe talk about other things, things that we might be doing like sports, or things that we might find to be true like scripture and the Bible and what Jesus says? Does really how we feel, should that be the first conversation we have when our kids come home, when our kids come home from school or what have you? How was today? How did you feel about this? I think that's a natural conversation. Does calling that and that frequency drive their identity formation maybe in a bad way? Or should we do it differently? What do you think?
I think that's a great question. I do think that frequency matters. I have regularly been saying to parents that children become who we say they are. So and that's especially true when they respect us, right? So if we are asking all the time about feelings and what did they do with their feelings, they're going to know that those are important to us and they'll become more self-aware, and that can be a healthy thing. But yeah, what do we talk about? What do we share from our lives that is going to influence what they decide is important, what they think matters to us? So if we never talk about academics, academics don't matter. If all we talk about is academics, how did you do? And how did the other kids do? And what are you going to do to improve your grade next time? If all we ever talk about is we empty the backpack or kids come home from a homeschool co-op is how did you do, then their whole identity is wrapped up in that and becomes stressful and fearful. And they ignore relationships. They ignore physical. They ignore spiritual. If you want to raise your kids to be spiritually fit, you got to talk about the things that Jesus cares about. It's so interesting to see, right? Like this, let me give you an obvious example. If people are doubting us, here's an obvious example. Everybody in my family roots for the Packers. Everybody. And it started with my grandfather, who had season tickets back in the day when they played some of their games in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we were raised in a suburb. And Dave and I and our cousins got to go to Packer games. We grew up with the green and the gold, and yes, the Cheeseheads. And now we're scattered. We're in Atlanta, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and I'm here in Fort Worth. And we have a text thread, and we wear green and gold, and we exchange Christmas gifts that have something to do with the Packers because we grew up with that and we still celebrate that. It's a big part of our identity. There is nothing wrong with that. We become like the people we hang out with.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Dr. Kathy, to think through. And I just think it's important for me to kind of lay it out there too, that I'm really sorry for you as a Packers fan, because you have a lot of opportunity to make the playoffs every year. And as a Vikings fan, we just know every year we're probably not going to make the playoffs. So it's a lot easier to cheer because we have less heartbreak, But I'd like to close out kind of talking about this, Dr. Kathy, because Dr. Folkes highlights that really our talk about mental health can make us think that almost everyone is ill. And that mode tries to destigmatize mental health challenges, that we almost actually promote that no one is actually really maybe ill. Everyone's just kind of normal when they battled through mental health things. And oftentimes when we present it like this, Dr. Folkes says that things can be overlooked. Real challenges or mental health crises can be overlooked because we kind of say, everyone battles with this. What would you recommend for parents to do in this cultural moment to guide their teen well today, knowing that so much of the conversation is really being done to destigmatize mental health and make it normal for us to really go to counseling or have different medications that we might be on, because that's really what everyone's on today. How should parents act and react and drive conversation in their homes knowing that's happening?
Great questions, Wayne. I'd prefer that we not react. I'd prefer that we act, which means that we have talked about this. If you are parenting with someone, you make sure that you're on the same page. If your kids are old enough, you even talk about it. I don't want everyone looking under a rock. Like, what's wrong with my kid? Something's got to be wrong with my kid. I know we're not normal. We can't be the only ones that are normal. No, you can. Let me give you permission to be normal. So it's a catch-22, right? I don't want us to ignore what is real, and I don't want us to look for something that is fake. And it's in the air we breathe almost, I think. So Abigail Shrier talks about how everyone believes maybe they've been traumatized, and that's why we're on the uptick with therapy, and it's not true. So one of the things I'd recommend to parents is that you keep a written record. And I write about this in my books. If you are concerned that your child maybe really have a tendency to quick anger, or critical spirit, or a depression, or a suicidal ideology, or stress, or anxiety, you're going to know that when you keep a written record. Are they always behaving that way? Very few kids are 24/7, 365 stressed. It might be only with math because their dad loves math and they want their dad to love them, so they think they have to love math too. It might be only when a certain babysitter comes over. It's only on, piano lesson day because they really don't like playing the piano and you haven't figured that out yet. So keep a written record and look for what is normal and what is, standard. And then you can kind of attack that issue as it shows up only with piano or only with math or only with a particular neighbor or only with a particular babysitter. And then you're going to discover that everything is okay and you can address that one issue in a targeted way.
As Dr. Kathy was talking, it reminded me of a passage that comes out of Deuteronomy chapter 6, and I'm going to begin reading at verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give to you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. I was reminded of this passage because Dr. Kathy talked about writing down really the things that are happening in our kids' lives and giving them kind of a framework or a reference point for them to have an understanding of what God is doing in a big picture, especially when we're faced with challenges, especially things that would challenge the way that we think, perceive, understand, and even interact with the world. What God does here for the nation of Israel in Deuteronomy 6 is encourages them to have a reference point, almost have a mooring point, a place where they, hook their ship to that keeps them from wandering out to sea or being tossed back and forth by the waves of the world, but really something that reminds them that God has worked in the past and is working today. I wonder if we do that for our kids, write down the things that God is doing today, if that can really give them a bright light that will help them shine and cut through some of the dark times in their lives. Before I go, I want to remind you that this podcast is brought to you by Summit Ministries, that dynamic 2-week camp that serves teens and college students with a deep dive into apologetics, why we think the way we do, why is the world the way it is, how does God shout and communicate his love for humanity and the world and how he redeems it to all of us. I encourage you to check it out if you're looking for a camp this summer or even next year or even in their gap year program. Summit Ministries is a big supporter of Celebrate Kids, and Dr. Kathy is a speaker at Summit Camps. For more information on Summit Ministries, go to summitministries.org/Celebrate Kids. That's summitministries.org/Celebrate Kids. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name is Wayne Stender. Thanks for listening to the Celebrate Kids podcast, this daily segment, Face in the Dark. We're so glad that you're joining us this week, and I'm looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.